Britain is an island. In 1939, that simple fact made it vulnerable in a way most nations could never be. Half of Britain's food was imported, nearly all of its oil, all of its copper, tin, rubber, and metals essential to war. Everything had to arrive by ship, across an ocean, through waters Germany increasingly controlled, with a weapon that would nearly win the war without ever setting foot on British soil. The U-boat. Not a battleship that could be sunk in a single engagement, not a fleet carrier that could be destroyed in one battle, not a weapon that required invasion or bombing campaigns or ground troops. A single submarine could do what the entire German Air Force could not. It could starve Britain into submission. This is how close Germany came to winning the war through mathematics alone, and how that victory was prevented not by naval genius or military valor, but by factories, codebreakers, and industrial will. Admiral Karl Donitz understood the mathematics perfectly. He sat down with pencil and paper and calculated what it would take to break Britain. 300 operational U-boats, he concluded. 300 submarines, attacking merchant convoys month after month, sinking cargo faster than it could be replaced. Without supplies, Britain would collapse within 2 years. No negotiation, no invasion needed, just the silent mathematics of attrition. He didn't have 300 submarines, but Germany was good at building weapons, and Donitz had invented something revolutionary in submarine warfare that would prove far more deadly than raw numbers alone: the wolf pack. The tactic was elegant in its brutality. A single U-boat would shadow a convoy, staying just outside its perimeter, maintaining contact but not attacking. The submarine would send a radio signal to other U-boats in the area. They would converge from different directions, moving into position. Then, when conditions were right, usually at night when the submarine's surface visibility equaled the convoy's, they would attack together from multiple angles. 4, 5, sometimes 6 submarines hitting the same convoy simultaneously. The escorts would be overwhelmed, ships would burn, cargo would sink, the wolfpack would scatter into darkness before reinforcements could arrive. It was a tactic that proved devastatingly effective. It would nearly win the war. The Type VII U-boat was engineered specifically for this role, not for comfort, not for aesthetic appeal, for lethality in efficiency. Every design decision was made with one goal: sink cargo and escape. At 220 feet long, the Type VII was large enough for extended operations across the Atlantic, a journey that required weeks of endurance, but it was small enough to be tactical, maneuverable, and hard to detect. The crew of 44 men lived in compartments so narrow that 2 men couldn't pass each other without one flattening against the wall. There was no privacy, no comfort, no space for anything that didn't contribute to the mission. Sailors slept in shifts and bunks that were still warm from the previous occupant. Everything on that submarine existed for one purpose: to sink ships and escape. The Type VII had 4 torpedo tubes facing forward and 2 aft. Each tube carried a 21-inch torpedo, the deadliest weapon in the Atlantic. A single torpedo could break a merchant ship in half. 2 or 3 could guarantee it would sink. In ideal circumstances, a U-boat could fire 5 torpedoes in rapid succession, then dive to reload. But reloading took time. Often, there wasn't time. The submarine would have to move on to the next target. The Type VII spent most of its time on the surface. This seems counterintuitive. Why would a submarine spend most of its time on the surface? But underwater, a Type VII could only travel at 5 knots. On the surface, it could travel at 17 knots, faster than most merchant ships, faster than many escorts. A submarine operating underwater was slow, blind, and limited. A submarine operating on the surface was fast, could see the horizon, could use its deck gun for targets too small to waste a torpedo on. It would attack at night when it was nearly invisible to the human eye, a dark shape against a dark horizon. Fire 4 or 5 torpedoes at close range, sink 1 or 2 ships, dive if the escorts got too close, escape into darkness. A single U-boat could sink between 50,000 and 300,000 tons of shipping in its lifetime. 50,000 tons is roughly equivalent to the cargo of 250 merchant ships. 300,000 tons is the cargo of 1,500 ships. A crew of 44 men could destroy more cargo than thousands of workers in a shipyard could build in months. The mathematics of the submarine were almost too good to be true. Germany understood the power of mass production. They had learned it from the Japanese aircraft industry, which was already mass-producing Zero fighters. The Type VII wasn't designed by artists or craftsmen. It was designed by engineers who understood production efficiency. The submarine was built in sections, the bow section in one yard, the middle section in another, the stern section in a third. The torpedo tubes, engines, and electrical systems could be built anywhere and assembled later. Multiple submarines could be under construction simultaneously in different parts of the same facility. This was revolutionary for submarine building. Submarines had always been built as unique vessels, expensive, time-consuming, requiring master craftsmen and precision fitting. The Type VII could be stamped out like automobiles coming off Henry Ford's assembly line, not quickly by traditional submarine standards, but quickly enough to matter. Between 1941 and 1943, Germany built over 700 Type VII U-boats. 700. Cheap by warship standards, reliable, deadly. The production rate meant that even if escorts sank some U-boats, new ones were constantly replacing them. Germany was building a navy underwater, a navy that didn't have to defeat the British surface fleet because it didn't have to engage it at all. By 1941, everything changed. Germany shifted to unrestricted submarine warfare. The gloves came off. Every merchant ship was a target. Neutral ships, unarmed ships, ships carrying medical supplies or Red Cross aid. If it was flying a flag other than German, it was a legitimate target. This decision made in Berlin would ripple across the Atlantic and nearly break Britain. When America entered the war in December 1941, U-boat crews experienced what they called the second happy time. American coastline kept their lights on, not blackout lights, full lights. Street lights illuminated the coastline, neon signs advertised restaurants and shops and bars. Ships sailed close to shore, and they were silhouetted against that glow like targets in a shooting gallery. U-boats hunted in the shallows off the American coast. From Florida to New York, ships were sunk in sight of land. American destroyers were deployed to the coast for defense, but there were never enough of them, never in the right place at the right time. U-boats would sink a ship one night and be gone by dawn. The losses were staggering. In March 1941, before America even entered the war, U-boats sank 243,000 tons of shipping. April, 405,000 tons. May, 325,000 tons. June, 310,000 tons. By summer 1942, losses had topped 500,000 tons per month. Every month, more ships went to the bottom than Britain could replace. Every month, the supply of food in Britain decreased. The equation that Donuts had written on paper seemed to be working exactly as predicted. Supplies became critical. Food rationing deepened from uncomfortable to severe. Meat rationing went from 4 ounces a week to 3 ounces a week. Sugar was rationed to less than an ounce per week. Factories slowed as raw materials became scarce. Without copper, you can't make bullets. Without rubber, you can't make tank treads. Without iron, you can't make ships to replace the ones being sunk. By spring 1941, Britain had weeks, not months of food left. Churchill himself would later admit that the only thing he feared during the war was the U-boat threat, not Nazi invasion, not the Luftwaffe, the U-boat. The British population faced a grim reality that most nations have never had to contemplate. An island with no land border cannot hold out without supplies arriving by sea. If the convoys stopped, Britain didn't slowly starve. It collapsed, not in years, not even in months, in weeks. The war would be over. Britain would surrender, and the war in Europe would be lost.
The British Merchant Navy bore the brunt of this assault. They were civilians in steel boxes waiting to be hit. They weren't soldiers with uniforms and ranks and military discipline. They were merchant sailors, some of them old men, some of them boys fresh from school, all of them terrified. Ships were sunk by day. Ships were sunk by night. A ship could survive for months, years even, making runs across the Atlantic, and then one night a torpedo would hit it in the dark and it would go down in minutes. Merchant sailors died in cold water. They died in flames when oil ignited on the surface. They died in darkness when lifeboats sank or drifted away from rescue for the crime of carrying food and supplies to home. The casualty rate in the merchant navy would reach 25% by the end of the war. 25%. That meant 1 in 4 merchant sailors wouldn't survive the war. In the Royal Navy, the casualty rate was lower. In the Army, it was lower. Only the U-boat crews themselves would suffer losses greater than the merchant sailors who were just trying to bring supplies home. Some of these men were rescued. They would float in lifeboats for hours or days, waiting for rescue ships that sometimes came and sometimes didn't. Those who survived spoke of the cold, the thirst, the despair of watching other ships burn on the horizon, knowing that rescue might not arrive before the ocean killed them. Others died instantly when their ships were torpedoed. The explosion would come without warning. One moment, the sailor was working his shift or sleeping in his bunk. The next moment, the ship was breaking apart. The compartments would flood. There would be no time to reach the lifeboats, no time for goodbye. The situation for Britain became desperate. The Admiralty had ASDIC, an early sonar system, but it only worked at close range and only when searching underwater. It didn't work when U-boats attacked on the surface at night. Depth charges required the escort to be directly above the submarine, and they had to be set to the correct depth to work. Get it wrong, and the charge would explode too deep or too shallow, and the submarine would escape. Aircraft could spot U-boats if they were in the right place at the right time, but there were never enough aircraft, and there was a massive stretch of ocean in the middle of the Atlantic where no aircraft could reach. The Atlantic Gap. It was about 400 miles wide. In this gap, U-boats were safe. They could attack convoys with impunity. They could refuel, repair, and rearm. U-boats called this gap a hunting ground. Convoys called it a death zone. By late 1942, some British officials privately contemplated something unthinkable, not surrender from invasion or bombardment, but surrender from starvation. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. Germany was sinking merchant ships faster than Britain could replace them. Britain was running out of food. Britain was running out of time, and there seemed to be no way to stop the U-boats. Churchill had called it a crisis. It was more than that. It was an existential threat, a weapon that couldn't be fought with conventional naval tactics, couldn't be beaten by courage or determination, because it operated in a realm where those things didn't matter. All that mattered was the mathematics. Donitz had written the equation on paper, and in 1942, Britain was living inside that equation. Then America entered the war with something Germany could never match: industrial capacity on a scale that had never existed before. The United States had emerged from the Depression with factories that could manufacture anything: automobiles, airplanes, tanks, weapons, and America committed to building something that Germany didn't think was worth building: millions of tons of merchant shipping. The United States committed to building something called the Liberty Ship. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't beautiful, it wasn't even particularly well designed. It was designed for one thing and one thing only: to be built quickly and cheaply, to carry cargo across the Atlantic and reach Britain. Whether it reached in style or comfort was irrelevant. Whether it would last 20 years or 5 years was irrelevant. All that mattered was that it could be built, and built fast. The Liberty Ship was 441 feet long. It could carry 9,000 tons of cargo. It was slower than most ships, powered by a single steam engine that produced just enough power to move it at 11 knots. 3 of them would break in half during rough seas while fully laden. But it could be built, and it could be built fast. Kaiser Shipbuilding began producing Liberty ships at a pace that seemed impossible. By 1943, Kaiser was launching a new Liberty ship every few days. The SS Robert E. Peary was built from keel laying to launching in 4 days and 15 hours. By the end of the war, America had built 2,710 Liberty ships. 2,710. That's over half of all American merchant tonnage in a war that lasted less than 4 years from America's entry to victory in Europe. That's more ships than Germany had built submarines in the entire war. The scale was absurd from Germany's perspective. Donitz had built 700 U-boats, America had built 2,710 merchant ships, and America could keep build them faster, build them cheaper, build them in greater numbers. In 1942, U-boats were sinking roughly 500,000 tons per month. American shipyards were building roughly 400,000 tons per month. The math was close. Germany was still winning the tonnage war. Sinkings exceeded production. Britain's supplies continued to dwindle. By 1943, with full American production online, shipyards were building 1.2 million tons per month, 1,200,000 tons per month. Suddenly, even if every U-boat succeeded at maximum efficiency, they couldn't keep pace. The equation had flipped completely. Donitz was still sinking ships, but he was sinking them slower than they were being replaced, and he was sinking them slower every month as more and more Liberty ships joined the convoys. This is the moment when industrial capacity defeated military ingenuity, when quantity overcame quality, when the factories won. But industrial production wasn't enough by itself. By 1943, 5 technological breakthroughs converged and changed everything about the war on the Atlantic. First, 10-centimeter radar. Radar technology had existed for years, but earlier radar systems were large and visible. U-boats could detect the radar emissions and know they were being hunted. This new 10-centimeter radar was small enough to be mounted on escort ships and aircraft. It worked reliably in all weather conditions, and critically, Germany didn't know it existed. The Germans had no idea that this technology had been developed. They didn't develop countermeasures because they didn't know there was anything to counter. For the first time in the war, U-boats operating on the surface, where they were fastest and most effective, were visible to the escorts hunting them. The darkness that had protected the submarines was penetrated by radio waves. The escorts could see in the dark. Second, the Lee light, a massive searchlight mounted on bombers, 22 million candle power, bright enough to turn night into day. A pilot would use radar to locate a U-boat in total darkness. The pilot would navigate using only the radar signal, flying in toward the target they couldn't see. Gliding in from altitude, getting closer and closer. The German crew had no idea they were being hunted. No warning, nothing. Then, at the last second, when the aircraft was directly above and too close to miss, the Lee light would snap on. 22 million candle power blinding the German crew in an instant. They couldn't see, they couldn't think. They were blind and helpless and about to die. The pilot would drop depth charges, now fused to explode at specific depths with new precision fuses. The submarine would take hits, the hull would breach, water would pour in, the U-boat would sink.
For German sailors, this became the ultimate nightmare. An invisible enemy, an unseen attack, death falling from a sky they couldn't see into. They would be on the surface, on lookout, scanning the darkness for threats, and then light would fill the universe and explosions would follow. The Lee light turned the U-boat's greatest advantage, darkness, into a death trap. Third, long-range patrol aircraft. The Liberator bomber could now cover the Atlantic Gap. Previously, the gap had been safe for U-boats. Now it wasn't. Aircraft with radar and Lee lights were patrolling constantly. U-boats on the surface in the Atlantic Gap were sitting ducks, and they died like ducks. Fourth, escort carriers, small aircraft carriers that could be built quickly and operated with convoys. They were slow, they were lightly armored, they were fragile, a single bomb or torpedo could sink them, but they provided something invaluable, continuous air cover directly above the convoys, where the U-boats were attacking, where the escorts needed help most. And fifth, something invisible and more important than all the others combined. At Bletchley Park in England, British codebreakers had cracked the German Enigma cipher. The Allies could read U-boat communications. Donitz would send orders to wolf packs, and within hours the Allies knew what he had said. They could route convoys away from the wolf packs before they ever made contact. They could position escorts to intercept attacking U-boats. They could see the hunters before the hunters saw them. In 1942, Germany added a fourth rotor to their Enigma machines. The cipher changed. The Allies went blind. For nearly a year, they couldn't read the U-boat traffic. Shipping losses skyrocketed.
But when the codebreakers finally cracked the new cipher, when they figured out the patterns in the logic and broke through the encryption, the Allies could see again. And when they could see, U-boats died. This is the moment when intelligence defeated doctrine, when information destroyed the Wolfpack tactics that had been so devastatingly effective. U-boats would attack thinking they had a target isolated, but the target was part of a well-prepared convoy, with escorts ready and waiting, with aircraft already airborne. The Wolfpack would be detected, surrounded, and destroyed. May 1943, it became known as Black May, the month when the U-boat arm effectively broke. A convoy designated SC-130 was attacked by a Wolfpack of U-boats. 7 submarines converged on the convoy at once, 7 U-boats coordinating their attack, using the tactics that had proved so devastatingly effective for years. This should have been an easy victory. Ships would burn, cargo would sink, the escorts would be overwhelmed. This time was different. The escorts were equipped with radar-guided depth charges, direction-finding radio receivers that could locate U-boats by their radio transmissions, and continuous air support from escort carriers. As the U-boats attacked, aircraft appeared out of the darkness, visibility provided by lee lights mounted on the fuselages. Depth charges fell before German crews could even reach their diving stations. Multiple U-boats were destroyed. Some sank outright. Others were damaged so severely they had to break off the attack. The convoy lost not a single ship, not one. 7 submarines attacked, and the convoy was not only defended successfully, but the attacking submarines were hunted down and killed. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was the beginning of the end. Throughout May 1943, U-boats were destroyed at a rate they couldn't sustain. 41 U-boats were sunk in a single month. 41. The best captains were dead or captured. The Wolfpacks were being hunted by enemies they couldn't see, couldn't fight, couldn't outrun. Dönitz realized the mathematics had changed fundamentally. The equation he had written on paper was no longer valid. The variables had shifted. The advantage had reversed. On May 24, 1943, just 1 month after the confidence of Black May began, Dönitz issued an order withdrawing U-boats from the North Atlantic. His message was stark, resigned, defeated. "We had lost the Battle of the Atlantic," he wrote. Germany didn't give up submarines. They couldn't afford to. They continued building them, trying new tactics, developing new technologies, acoustic torpedoes that could lock on to the sound of a ship's propeller, snorkels that would allow submarines to run diesel engines while submerged, radar warning receivers that might alert them to the presence of aircraft. But the strategic moment had passed. The tonnage war was lost. Britain would not be starved into submission. The U-boats that remained fought on. Some commanders achieved remarkable successes. Individual skippers still sank significant tonnage, but they were no longer winning a war. They were fighting against mathematical certainty, fighting against an equation that couldn't be solved. In 1944, Germany was losing more U-boats than it could build. Even with Kaiser's production capability, America's shipyards were replacing merchant ships faster than Germany could replace U-boats. The casualty rate for U-boat crews became catastrophic. Out of 40,000 men who served in the U-boat fleet during the war, 30,000 would die. 30,000. A 75% fatality rate, the highest of any German service branch. Higher than the Luftwaffe, higher than the Wehrmacht, higher than any other military organization in the war. Being a U-boat sailor was a death sentence. By 1944, most crews knew it. They knew the statistics. They knew that the Allies had broken their codes, that the Atlantic was now more dangerous than ever before, that the advantages that made the Type VII so effective were now gone. They knew that volunteering for U-boat duty was volunteering for death. And still they served. Still they went out. Still they died in the Atlantic. The Type VII U-boat came closer, perhaps than any single weapon, to changing the course of World War II. It nearly starved Britain into submission. For a terrifying moment in 1941 and 1942, Dönitz's mathematics seemed correct. Britain was running out of food. Britain was running out of time. Britain would collapse not from invasion, but from the simple absence of sustenance.
But the Type VII faced an enemy with superior industrial capacity, an enemy with codebreakers who could see the U-boats coming before they ever attacked, an enemy with searchlights that turned night into day, an enemy with factories that could replace losses faster than any weapon could inflict them, an enemy, in short, that understood that winning a total war meant more than designing a better weapon. It meant having the will, the resources, and the determination to outproduce, outthink, and outlast. The victory wasn't won by any single thing. It wasn't won by naval tactics alone. It wasn't won by courage alone. It was won by Liberty ships being built at impossible speeds in American shipyards, by codebreakers in a country house in England reading enemy communications in real time, by pilots flying through darkness with new radar and searchlights, hunting prey they couldn't see but could kill, by thousands of workers in American factories building faster than anyone thought possible. And it was won at a cost measured in blood. 30,000 German sailors who never came home. Thousands of merchant mariners killed carrying food and supplies home from America to Britain. Men who died in cold water, in flames, in darkness. Children and wives left without husbands and fathers. Entire crews lost with their ships, leaving no survivors, no remains, no grave to mark the spot where they fell. They were victims of a mathematical certainty they couldn't escape, the certainty that industrial capacity, intelligence, and technology working together are more powerful than any single weapon, no matter how brilliantly engineered. The certainty that in a total war, the side that can build more, think faster, and outmaneuver its enemy will ultimately prevail. The U-boat nearly changed the war, nearly broke Britain, nearly forced surrender without invasion, nearly proved that a single weapon, multiplied by courage and determination, could achieve what armies couldn't. But in the end, the factories won.